Bitcoin just keeps going on. I figure I'll be doing this in 9.5 more years. So my very first contribution was to PyCoin, an old Python Bitcoin library that at one point was used to sign a decent percentage of the transactions on the Bitcoin network. And it was to the randomness of what we use to derive addresses. And so I'm going to be talking about today about that problem that still very much exists in wallets. Wallets manage secrets, and cryptographic secrets require proper use of randomness. So I'm going to talk about a cool project that's gotten some traction that now has many implementations. You may have even used it. And if you don't, I encourage you to use it.
Yeah, and you've also worked on Biddle. You've worked at Bitcoin companies.
Oh, yeah. So I'm co-maintainer of Biddle, the Python Bitcoin library, written by me and Jimmy Song. I've written a number of different wallet software implementations, BC Wallet for BlockCypher in 2015. A lot of the Biddle powers a lot of Hermit, an open source multi-sig library and wallet that Unchained publishes. Let's see, BlockCypher's Block Explorer in 2014. I've written a lot of Bitcoin stuff.
Yeah. So let's jump into the first one, right? The BIP39 seed picker process. What is it? What is entropy?
Yeah.
How does that work?
So this is not one that I wrote directly. Just we're going to talk a little bit about BIP39 wallets, which are the 12 to 24 words, the seed phrase words that you use to back up your wallet, to restore your wallet if it were lost, to change potentially from one wallet to another. You just type those words into your next wallet. And that's a standard that got developed over many, many years. If you were in Bitcoin a long time ago, you might remember key pools from Bitcoin Core, or you might remember paper wallets, which were surprisingly used by people to hold lots and lots of Bitcoin, but not the best solution. And eventually we standardized on these seed words, these BIP39 seed words, your 12 to 24 words. And it's a really great way because you do that once and you have Bitcoin addresses for life. You can generate billions of them from that. And so back it up once and you're set to go. And one of the big challenges we say in Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coins. But how do you know that your keys are yours? How do you know that the random number generation process, probably in your hardware wallet, but maybe in your software, is working as designed? And so there's this terrifying concept of something called a retirement attack, where you generated your 12 to 24 words offline. You did it on a device that doesn't have a Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. It's not connected to the internet. You diligently wrote it down. But how do you know that it really did generate those from a true source of randomness? And unfortunately, there is not a way to verify randomness. So for example, if you had a random number generator and you asked it for a number between 1 and a billion, and it gave you the number 7, well, what are the odds that that's true? It's possible. 1 in a billion times that would be the case. But probably that number between 1 and a billion would be somewhere around 500 million the vast majority of the time, not 1 or a billion. And so it's a hard thing to prove. How do you know those 12 to 24 words are yours? And in the scariest case, there's a million places along the way where it could have been tampered with. So perhaps, the person in the factory that was making the hardware wallet slipped in some code so that only a billion different seed phrases were possible. And you got one of the billion and you went on your happy way receiving Bitcoin. And 5 years later, as they saw the balances grew, one day they decided to drain all the wallets. And this would be like a big threat to Bitcoin at all. And I should say this attack has never happened. I wouldn't lose sleep about it. And if you use multisig, you're pretty much entirely defended. So this is more of a concern for people in the single sig camp. And so about 4 years ago, I was more and more concerned about this problem. And I stumbled on something written by a Swedish developer called seedpicker.net. You can use this free open source tool if you want. And it advises you to pull words out of a hat. So you pull 23 words out of a hat. And the 24th word is actually a checksum. It's not something you could calculate in your head. So you need a piece of software to tell you the 24 words. And so instead of trusting a random number generator, you are the random number generator. And you really pulled those words out of a hat and that they were accurate. But it was designed for Electrum, which at the time for multisig, Electrum was very difficult to use. And it wasn't adopted by anyone. It wasn't made in a way that would be easily interoperable. And so I ended up talking to the developer who built it and showed him a little prototype I had written in Python and said, hey, what if we could make this something that was easier to use? And he did. He took all my feedback. I never met the guy, Martin in Sweden. And it became sort of a more popular thing. And now if you're using a cold card, if you're using Spectre Desktop, or sorry, Spectre DIY, if you're using Seed Signer, which that project started from this. And what's the fourth one? Oh, that's a Cold Card Spectre DIY. Keystone. All of these just natively support this. So this is a feature built into your hardware wallet. You don't have to trust it. What's so cool about this is this was never like a conversation that had to happen among Bitcoin Core developers. This was never something that really had to have consensus. This is just a tool you can use. And I think that's probably the hidden part in Bitcoin development that isn't seen. BIPs are great. There's all kinds of amazing technologies that have come to Bitcoin over the years. Multisig, SegWit, Taproot are all awesome. But that's not the only place where Bitcoin development happens. And that's a really unique thing in that all companies do this differently. When this was originally proposed, some people wanted to roll dice. And rolling dice is another way that if you know what you're doing, you can generate your words from dice rolls. That works too. It's a little more complicated to explain how you get from dice to your seed phrase, but you can do that, and you can not trust your hardware wallet in that way too. And so it's become this weird thing that is just like a strange idea. A random Swedish developer has a website up that works with Electrum, and then more and more people start building these. And my guess is that in 5 years, every hardware wallet will support this, and they'll probably even sell you a bag of words with your hardware wallet. In fact, there's a new product called Entropia. I don't know the team that makes this one. It looks like an Advil bottle, only every single pill is a BIP39 word. So instead of having to cut out all the words yourself, you can, pay someone to do it for you. There is some risk, maybe that's actually only half the words are in there. You'd have to line them all up, all 2048, and check. So I'm not saying you should necessarily trust this company, but the risk of trusting anyone in this is pretty low. And so it's an example of where all around the margins, anyone can propose any idea. If it starts to get traction, other people might adopt it. And I think in the future, it will be very suspicious if a hardware wallet doesn't do this. And I won't name any specific one because every hardware wallet vendor has had vulnerabilities. So it's not about them specifically, but there was one that had a true random number generator in their hardware wallet and shipped the device and forgot to turn it on. And so the device was using not the cryptographically secure random number generator until it got a software update that caught that. But plenty of people did generate seeds using an insecure random number generator. To my knowledge, none of them, that vulnerability wasn't easily exploitable. So none of them lost money, to my knowledge. But it's not a impossible point. And it could be injected anywhere. It could be a rogue employee. It could be the shipping service that ships it. It could be something as simple as a fake Amazon store that's selling you a fake device. But if you can verify it yourself, then it's not a concern. So it's really sort of a neat one. And how do you take something we already have and just make it better? And there are so many projects doing things like this that you may have interacted with all the time that are sort of pushing Bitcoin forward.
I was afraid you were going to take it end to end there. I was just listening. No, you talk about you met this, or you didn't meet him. You just heard about this guy, Martin, in Sweden, working on this project. It caught your eye. I think that one thing I would like to hear more about is that, Bitcoin itself is an open source project, but so much of what we use around Bitcoin, whether it's hardware wallets, whether it's things that Unchained, like Hermit, like you mentioned before, they're also open source projects. You were talking about if you can verify yourself. What is the benefit of not just Bitcoin Core being open source, but the entire ecosystem of software that we're using around Bitcoin being open source, not closed source? When would you be worried about something being closed source?
Yeah. So open source is amazing because we have this expression in Bitcoin, don't trust, verify. And when it comes to your money, that's really something where you don't want to be trusting that somebody else got it right. Closed source is a different model. It doesn't guarantee failure. There's plenty of closed source things out there that do work. You probably didn't inspect the open source code on the elevator that you took today, and I don't think anyone's at risk. But it's much better if you don't have to trust, and you get the added guarantee that everybody else is looking at that code base. So Bitcoin Core has the most eyeballs of any software project in human history to be out there, and people are looking at it. It's the world's largest bug bounty program in a sense, and so you can sleep at night. Every day that Bitcoin survives is a day that you say, this is more battle tested, more verified. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say never use any closed source software. There is no open source secure element, for example. So, it would be magically nice if we had secure elements that were open source, but they don't currently exist. But to me, that gives you this extra assurance. You also get that people just want to build on top of it. As so many projects came out of other projects because you could build. Builders love to build, and open source is a tool to do that. So, we've seen lots of iteration of projects over time where somebody just took something and said, hey, I can do more or better with this. And oftentimes the next person said, oh, great, run with it, have fun. And if they don't like it, well, there's nothing they can do anyway. It's open source. And so that's a great thing about Bitcoin that maybe hasn't been highlighted as much prior to Bitcoin's existence.
Yeah. And, you're one of these people, right? I mean, since I've known you, you've been working on open source projects, usually tangentially related to Bitcoin. And so like the motivation there, I mean, I see how it's good for everyone in the audience. Why is it good for you? Why are you contributing to open source projects? I mean, 5 of them, 4 or 5 of them, pretty intent, a large contributor there.
Yeah. Sometimes the biggest motivation is that you just want to use it. So for example, I authored this proposal on how to blind your extended public keys in a multi-sig. This is a little bit more of a complicated advanced thing. I don't recommend it for day-to-day users, but if you kept a seed phrase in a safe deposit box at a bank, for example, and rogue employee or under order of government official drilled that safe and saw your seed phrase, could they see what Bitcoin it was co-signing on? And there is a way to hide that. And that was just out of my own curiosity. I thought, well, why should these seed phrases, if someone gets access to one seed phrase and you're 3 of 5, why should they learn anything? And so that was my own interest. A lot of the BitL Python library, I just wanted more tools to sign multi-sig transactions in case one of the hardware wallets went out of business,
or in case Vitalik software that was not being maintained went belly up.
And a famous example, Vitalik. Okay, well, to be fair, I have like a small personal beef. In 2015, I found a security vulnerability in PyBitcoin tools, which was Vitalik's library. Very minor one, although it was also in how to add entropy to a private key, which is kind of funny. That topic just never goes away. Yeah. It was 2 characters. It was just a rounding error that was rounding off like 3 orders of magnitude decrease in entropy that was being added in. So it wasn't really exploitable, but it wasn't done correctly. And Vitalik closed the pull request and then made the change himself. So I didn't get the credit for having found the vulnerability, which is kind of a real snub in programming. Like I fixed your thing, you just hit the button and then I get the credit. And sure enough, if you follow up on that library, he's since deleted it. And there have been a lot of vulnerabilities where people have lost money. So, an open source, healthy, contributing ecosystem where people submit pull requests and make changes, you get a much safer product on the other side. But you also just get to do whatever you want with it. Anyone's library, they can do what they want.
So a lot of this is, I mean, like for you, you're scratching your own itches. I've been over to your house and seen dozens of hardware wallets and things that you're tinkering with and things like that. How can people here credibly verify that the open source projects that they're using are legitimate, right?
Yeah, verification is really hard. I think one of the biggest things about this is why I pitch multi-sig so hard. Threshold multi-sig, something like a 2 of 3 if you're getting started, is a great place for 90% of people. It makes it a lot easier to verify because you have multiple devices that are all going to tell you the same thing. So you may not have read the code, they may not all be open source, but you have 2 devices that are saying, hey, do you want to send 1 Bitcoin to address X? And you're seeing that on the trusted displays of 2 different devices. You don't have to be a software engineer to say, hey, this cold card and this keystone, they match. That's really neat. That's the easiest one. Much harder things, read the code. If you don't know how to read the code, learn the code. Very, very hard. Find people that you trust who you think, aren't selling you something. And if they tell you, hey, this project's super legit, play with it. You learn so much just by using stuff. It really, before you use something, it's very hard to say that you truly understand how it works.
There seems to be kind of a threshold of you mentioned, with open source projects, one of the great things is anyone can contribute. That's the nature of open source. And so there seems to be some credibility that comes with seeing a project where there's a lot of different contributors, right? There's not a single person just closing down pull requests and saying like, oh, I'll fix it myself later someday, right? Is there a way like a normal person could look and say like, oh, there actually are lots of people looking at this, and maybe I'll find one of them and talk to them about the project?
Yeah. So I like to look at the number of active contributors on a project, and you can actually see their contributions over time, but all of these metrics are gameable. So like all of the shitcoins will have like sock puppet accounts making trivial changes, to the README file constantly to show activity. So it's a, and I remember there was even an airdrop of one token called Handshake. By no means is this an endorsement of any kind, but they just took people who had it was, I think, 1,000 followers on GitHub or something like that.
Yeah. And
they gave us all a decent amount of money, which was wild. And, that's a very gameable metric. You can just get people to follow you on their free GitHub accounts. So seeing lots of contribution activity is really good, but it's not an easily verifiable thing to measure. But when you see a project has it, like Bitcoin Core, where you have many, many contributors contributing regularly over long periods of time, you know that this thing is bulletproof. I mean, any one of them could get hit by a bus tomorrow and the project would go on exactly as it were. A lot of projects are just one or two people. And so, they might just decide they need more income and, get a different job and be unavailable. It's not so easy to know that they're going to be around. But when a project reaches a certain threshold of many contributors, it's really a magical thing. That thing will live on potentially longer than those people do, which is pretty neat. And if you're looking for something for you to use to store your own Bitcoin, that's a great standard to have.
So, trying to think of how to say this. The last thing I wanted to ask you was kind of, before Bitcoin, I think the biggest open source project out there was probably Linux. It had the most eyeballs on it, the most contributors and things like that. Bitcoin being open source itself was a requirement to make any claim towards decentralization, right? And we see all these other projects coming up around Bitcoin that are also open source. And I'm wondering, I mean, we haven't talked about this before, is the requirements of open source to be considered decentralized, how Bitcoin compared to, say, some other projects where, they might be open source, but they have a foundation behind them, or they have, a control group funding them. How does all this get funded? Why does open source matter in Bitcoin, the way Bitcoin does it, towards the decentralized narrative that we have?
Yeah. So by definition, you can't be decentralized without being open source, but being open source doesn't make you decentralized. And I think that's a really, really tricky thing. I mean, one of the most extreme versions that we saw of this was in the fork wars when SegWit was being activated. Everybody was saying what they wanted in a way that was hard to digest. We knew that the majority of mining operators wanted bigger blocks through a hard fork. We knew that the majority of exchanges wanted a hard fork for bigger blocks. There were a lot of prominent Bitcoiners who wanted that. And you had an anonymous developer, Shallow and Fry, release BIP 148, and a lot of core developers were against it. And that ultimately was the thing that caused SegWit to be activated and won the day. And that was not so straightforward to see in advance. So the fact that it was totally open source, that anyone could propose anything, that anyone could run any software, meant that we truly got to see that nobody controls this thing. That's something that only Bitcoin has experienced. And probably only Bitcoin could survive that trial by fire. Yeah. So it's a really unique thing. It makes development much harder. Most projects have a benevolent dictator for life, a BDFL, and they just get to make the decisions. And this is an accepted term in software engineering culture for decades. Nobody questions this. It's not a problem.
That's what Mike Hearn wanted.
Yeah. And for the BDFL, it's a pretty good gig. You can't be ousted. But in Bitcoin, it just can't work that way because, one person could decide, oh, I don't know how I feel about this 21 million. Or maybe if you don't spend your coins every, X years, we're going to take some percentage of them. Or who knows what other idea they might have. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the fact that we have a completely decentralized, completely open source network means that no one can exert that kind of control. The flip side is if you want to do anything, you have to get everyone to agree. And that's really hard. So I think that is a challenge in and of itself. And when I go back to this example of Seed Picker, there are people that are staunchly in the dice are the best way to generate entropy camp because everybody has dice in their home or at least can get them at the corner store, and cutting out 2,048 words, it your fingers get tired. And it's a great task if you have children. You can have them cut out 2,048 words. They don't have to do it perfectly. And they're like, these are things that people would really debate about. And they say, well, our hardware wallet's going to be dice only, and our hardware wallet's going to be, picking words out of a hat only. And it sounds silly, but if this is the thing that you're working on, you need that interoperability. You have to get consensus, or how are you going to verify something if one thing does it one way and one thing does it another way? And there were other little decisions too. And this is a good example because it's the most trivial thing. This isn't particularly complicated. It's not particularly contentious. Imagine if we were looking at a feature that added privacy or impacted scalability or transaction fees or centralization. That is a much, much more complicated thing to get people to agree on. And Bitcoin does not have a BDFL. And we should be very thankful for that. But it does make it very, very different. So it's just a one-of-a-kind, decentralized open source thing.
Okay, actual last thing then, which is, with all the different projects going on in and around Bitcoin right now, open source projects, things that you've looked at, one, what is your favorite thing going on right now that maybe the audience hasn't heard about? And two, what project needs more eyeballs on it?
Ooh. So I guess my two favorites are both having to do with multisig. They're Spectre Desktop and Sparrow. And they're both tools that connect to your Bitcoin Core node and make it really easy to do multisig in a self-sovereign way with no trusted third party. If you were familiar with some of the talks before, people were talking about the wallet and Bitcoin Core. It really does look like it's like straight from the 90s. It's not the easiest thing to use. And if you're trying to do multisig with it, you're going to need some expertise. But if you use a free open source piece of software like Spectre Desktop or like Sparrow, you can connect that to your Bitcoin Core node, and it gives you a nice graphical user interface. And it's pretty straightforward to like add a hardware wallet and decide, are you 2 of 3 or 3 of 5 or whatever numbers you want. And it takes care of all the little stuff, like maybe this hardware wallet you plug in with USB cable, and maybe this hardware wallet does things over an SD card, and this hardware wallet uses QR codes. And it just makes all that very simple and straightforward. So I love both of those projects. Spectre Desktop has a really large contributor base. I wrote the Merkle proofs for Spectre Desktop, but I'm just a tiny contributor of very many. And so that project is probably going to be running great in 10 years. Sparrow is basically one guy, Craig Raw, who is amazing. He's built a phenomenal product, and he's like a nice guy. You can like ask him questions about how to use it on Twitter and he'll answer. But it's just one guy. So I wish other people were contributing to Sparrow because it's fantastic, but it is just Craig.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for all the work you're doing on Bitcoin.